Welcome back, everyone. We've got quite a bit to get through today. Fires, protests, Elon Musk, TikTok, even crocodile skulls.
It sounds like we've got our work cut out for us.
Let's start with some good news, at least for some people in LA. The evacuation orders for Hollywood Hills West have been lifted now that the Sunset Fire is contained.
Yeah, that's a relief for those 15,000 residents who had to pack up and leave their homes. But it's not all good news for LA. Sadly, 5 people have died because of these fires and that Pacific Palisades fire. Well, it's officially the most destructive in LA history. Over 1,000 buildings gone, just like that.
It's hard to imagine, and what's really concerning is that LA's fire systems, they just weren't built for wildfires like these. They're having to improvise, even pulling water from swimming pools.
Exactly. It really shows how important it is for cities, even ones that aren't usually known for wildfires, to start thinking about climate change and how it's going to affect their infrastructure. We're seeing these extreme weather events more and more often.
That's for sure. Okay, so let's move on to a different part of the world. Things are getting pretty tense in Puching, China. There have been some pretty violent protests after a student died, and a lot of people think the government might be trying to cover something up.
Yeah, right now the official story is that this teenager fell from his dorm building, just a terrible accident. But online, it's a different story. People are saying he was bullied, that his injuries don't match the official report, that his family wasn't even allowed to see his body properly. There's a lot of distrust, and it's making people angry.
And that anger's boiling over. We've seen videos, verified videos, of protesters clashing with police, vandalizing offices. They want the truth.
What's really interesting, though, is how the government's reacting. They're trying to censor everything, scrub the story from the internet, even denying that the protests are happening at all. Reminds me of what happened with the white paper protests. The government really didn't like that.
It seems like any time people in China try to speak out, the government cracks down pretty hard. All right, let's shift gears again, this time to Germany. Elon Musk just did something that's causing a lot of controversy. He's come out and endorsed the AfD, the far-right party, and he even gave an interview to their leader, Alice Weidel.
Yeah, that raised some eyebrows for sure. Musk says he did it because of his investments in Germany, the Tesla factory and all that. But a lot of people are worried because the AfD has been linked to some pretty extreme views and some pretty unsavory groups. Giving them this kind of platform is a big deal.
And in this interview, Weidel was trying to make the AfD sound more mainstream, saying they're conservative and libertarian and that the media just portrays them unfairly. But then she said something really strange. She claimed that Hitler was a communist.
Yeah, that was weird. Who knows what she was thinking? Maybe she really believes it. Maybe she was just trying to appeal to Musk, who, calls himself a libertarian. Whatever the reason, it's definitely got people talking. But even with Musk's support, the AfD probably won't be able to form a government in Germany. They're doing well in the polls, but no other party wants to work with them.
So it's a lot of noise, but probably not going to change much in the end.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about TikTok. They're in a tough spot right now, trying to convince the Supreme Court to overturn this U.S. ban. The stakes are really high.
Yeah, this case could have huge consequences, not just for TikTok, but for all sorts of foreign tech companies operating in the U.S. The government saying TikTok's a national security risk because they think the Chinese government could force them to hand over user data or use TikTok to spread propaganda. Of course, TikTok says that's ridiculous. They say the ban is unfair and violates free speech.
And they're running out of time. If they don't break ties with their Chinese owner by January 19th, they're going to be blocked in the U.S. Lower courts have already ruled against them. But then we had this unexpected twist. Trump actually asked them to hold off on enforcing the ban so he could try to work out some kind of deal.
Yeah, that was a curveball, definitely threw a wrench in the works. So now everyone's waiting to see what the Supreme Court will do.
I mean, this is a big deal. If they lose, TikTok could disappear from app stores overnight. No more updates, no more new users. It could be the end of TikTok as we know it.
Yeah, and it could set a precedent for other foreign tech companies, too. It's kind of scary to think that the U.S. government could just ban any app they want based on, what they think might happen. All right, let's switch gears again, head over to the Arctic. Trump wants to buy Greenland, and Denmark, well, they're not so sure about that.
Yeah, Trump's been pretty clear. He wants Greenland, and he's even threatened to hit Denmark with tariffs if they don't sell it to him. Denmark's in a tough spot. They're trying to be diplomatic about it. emphasizing that Greenland has a lot of autonomy and downplaying the whole military threat thing.
It's a delicate situation. Greenland has its own independence movement, and Denmark doesn't want to step on their toes. At the same time, they're stuck dealing with Trump and his unpredictable demands. It's a real mess.
And the whole world's watching, especially other countries in the EU. They're worried about territorial integrity, and they've already warned the U.S. against using force. This is way bigger than just the U.S. and Denmark. It could affect the whole geopolitical landscape.
And then there's the economic side of things. A trade war with the U.S. would be a disaster for Denmark. It's a tense situation, that's for sure. Okay, let's move on to something a little more serious. There's been a big development in the 9/11 case.
Yeah, the mastermind behind the attacks, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and two other guys were supposed to plead guilty. But the U.S. government just threw a wrench in the works. They're objecting to the whole deal.
This case has been dragging on forever, and this plea deal, where they plead guilty to avoid the death penalty, seemed like it might finally bring some closure. But now the government's saying that accepting those guilty pleas would be harmful to the public and to the government itself.
It's a really complicated situation. Some of the victims' families are angry about the deal, while others say it's the best way to finally move on. Now it's all up in the air, and it's going to be up to the Trump administration to decide what happens next. And their whole stance on plea deals and Guantanamo could have a huge impact on how this all plays out.
Yeah. So this next story is, well, it's a little strange. Big companies like Boeing and Google are giving a ton of money to Trump's inauguration fund, $1 million each.
Yeah, and they're not the only ones. Chevron, Meta, Amazon, Uber, even the big car companies, Ford, GM, Toyota, they're all chipping in. Seems like everyone wants to get on the new president's good side. Boeing's saying it's just a tradition. Both parties get support from businesses.
And Google's going to be streaming the whole thing, putting it right on their homepage. Big tech and politics getting closer and closer these days. Speaking of politics, let's talk about the Supreme Court. They just made a pretty big decision, one that could affect Trump's second term.
Right. They said no to his request to delay the sentencing in that hush money case, the one where he was found guilty of, well, basically trying to hide those payments to Stormy Daniels.
Mm-hmm.
And the sentencing date is coming up fast, January 10th, just days before he takes office again.
Trump was saying that going through with the sentencing would hurt the presidency, that it would mess things up for the government. But the court didn't buy it. They said if he has any problems with it, he can appeal later. What's interesting is that it was a split decision, 5-4, and some of the conservative justices actually sided with the liberals on this one.
Trump's reaction has been pretty low-key, all things considered. He's still saying the whole case is bogus, but he admitted that the court's decision was fair. Of course, he couldn't resist taking a swipe at the judge, said he shouldn't have been on the case in the first place.
Sounds like he's trying to walk a fine line, showing respect for the court while still making it clear that he's not happy about it. It'll be interesting to see how he handles all these legal issues while he's also trying to, run the country. Okay, so shifting gears a bit, there's some sad news out of Iran. A Swiss citizen who was arrested for spying has died in prison.
We don't know a lot about what happened yet. Iranian media is saying it was suicide, but the authorities are saying they tried to save him. They haven't released the guy's name or any details about his case.
This is a tricky situation because Switzerland is kind of a go-between for the U.S. and Iran. They represent American interests there because, well, the U.S. and Iran don't exactly get along. So this death could make things even more complicated between those countries.
And Iran has a history of arresting people with dual citizenship or foreigners and accusing them of spying. It's often seen as a way for them to get leverage in international negotiations. This case is likely to make things even more tense between Iran and the West. All right, let's move on to Chad. The government there just stopped an attack on the presidential palace.
24 people, armed with knives, went after the guards. It turned into a big fight, and 19 people ended up dead, including one of the soldiers. Pretty scary stuff. Makes you wonder about how secure things are in the region.
The foreign minister said the whole thing was chaotic, didn't make any sense. He even suggested that the attackers might have been drunk or high, which, if true, just makes the whole thing even weirder.
Chad's had a lot of instability over the years, a recent change in leadership, fights with Boko Haram, that kind of thing. This attack happened right after the Chinese foreign minister left, too, which adds another layer of complexity.
It seems like everything's kind of coming together at once. Internal politics, regional instability, foreign involvement. It's a recipe for trouble. Chad's part of what they call the coup belt in Africa, a region where military takeovers are pretty common. It's a reminder of how fragile things are in some parts of the world.
Okay, let's lighten things up a bit. This next story is kind of funny in a weird way. A Canadian guy was caught trying to smuggle a crocodile skull through the Delhi airport.
Can you imagine? They're doing a security check, and they find this skull wrapped up in cloth. They said it looked like it came from a baby crocodile.
Of course, you can't just bring something like that into India. It violates all kinds of wildlife protection and customs laws. The guy said he bought it as a souvenir in Thailand and that he didn't kill the crocodile himself.
But the authorities aren't taking any chances. They're doing tests to figure out what kind of crocodile it was, and they're still investigating. It's a good reminder that even something that seems like a harmless souvenir can get you in big trouble, especially when you're dealing with protected species and international borders.
Right.
All right, let's move on to some good news, finally. Lebanon has a new president after being stuck in political gridlock for 2 years.
This is a huge deal for Lebanon, a country that's been struggling with all sorts of problems, political instability, economic troubles, you name it. The new president is Joseph Aoun. He's the head of the army. He had a lot of support from Hezbollah, the U.S., France, Saudi Arabia. Everyone seems to think he's the right guy for the job.
It's a big step towards getting things back on track in Lebanon. Aoun's election gives people hope that maybe, finally, they can start addressing all these problems. And it's good timing, too, because there's a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah right now, which means maybe the region's finally starting to calm down a bit.
Speaking of calming down, let's go back to the Arctic for a minute. Remember Trump wanting to buy Greenland? Well, Russia's been watching that whole situation very closely.
They're not too happy about it. The Kremlin's saying they want peace and stability in the Arctic, which they see as part of their national interest. And when Trump started talking about maybe using force to get Greenland, well, that really got their attention.
The other European countries are nervous too. They're saying that Greenland's territory should be respected and that the U.S. shouldn't even think about using force. It's a really delicate situation. Greenland wants to be independent from Denmark, but they also rely on Denmark for a lot of their money. Some people in Greenland think the U.S. could be a good ally, but others are worried about getting caught up in some kind of power struggle.
It's a complicated mix of history, economics, and politics. Whatever happens with Greenland is going to have a big impact on the Arctic and beyond. All right, let's shift gears to China. They're trying some interesting things to boost their economy. They've got this program where you can trade in your old stuff for discounts on new stuff, and they're expanding it to include kitchen appliances now.
Yeah, so now you can trade in your old microwave, dishwasher, rice cooker, even your water purifier, and get money off a new one. The government's hoping this will get people spending more and help the economy grow.
They're putting a lot of money into this program too, 81 billion yuan. But some experts are saying it's not going to be enough. They think China has bigger problems to deal with, like people not having confidence in the economy and that whole property crisis.
It just goes to show that even the second biggest economy in the world has its problems. And with the threat of a trade war with the U.S. looming, things could get even tougher for China. Okay, let's talk about sports for a minute. India's cricket team is having a rough time.
They just lost their test series against Australia pretty badly too, 3-1. That means they're out of the running for the World Test Championship final. And this comes after a bunch of other losses, including that embarrassing series against New Zealand where they didn't win a single match. It's clear that the team's going through some changes. Some of their star players are getting older, and they haven't really found anyone to replace them yet. Their next series is against England, and that's always a tough one for them. There's a lot of pressure on the team right now.
Especially on the two biggest names, Rohit Sharma and Virat Kohli. They just haven't been playing well lately, and people are starting to wonder if it's time for them to step aside and let some younger guys take over.
There are some promising young players waiting for their chance, but it's hard to say if they can fill the shoes of those two legends. The future of Indian cricket is kind of up in the air right now. Okay, this next story is pretty wild. It's about a Chinese actor, Wang Xing, who disappeared in Thailand. Turns out he was kidnapped and taken to Myanmar, where he was forced to work in one of those online scam centers. It sounds like something out of a movie. He went to Thailand for what he thought was an acting job, and the next thing he knows, he's being trafficked across the border and forced to scam people online.
His girlfriend was the one who figured out what happened. She started posting about it on social media, begging for help. Her story went viral, celebrities started sharing it, and eventually the authorities got involved. It's amazing how much power social media can have sometimes.
The Thai and Chinese authorities worked together to rescue Wang Xing, but his story shows that there's a much bigger problem going on. There are tons of these scam centers in Southeast Asia, and they're trapping people and forcing them to commit crimes.
Wang Xing's case has encouraged other victims to come forward, and now there's a petition going around demanding that something be done about these scam centers. But the authorities are being really secretive about the whole thing. There are rumors that they made some kind of deal to get Wang Xing released, and they don't seem to be doing much to actually shut these centers down.
It's a reminder that the internet can be a dangerous place, and that you have to be careful about who you trust, especially when you're traveling abroad. Okay, let's talk about some international politics. The U.S. just did something pretty drastic. They put sanctions on one of Viktor Orbán's closest allies in Hungary.
Yeah, this is a big deal because it's not very often that you see NATO allies doing this to each other. It shows that the relationship between the U.S. and Hungary is really strained right now. The guy who got sanctioned, Antal Rogin, is accused of being involved in corruption, basically helping Orbán undermine democracy and the rule of law in Hungary.
The U.S. ambassador to Hungary, David Pressman, has been really critical of Orbán's government. He's saying that these sanctions are necessary to fight corruption and protect democracy. But Hungary's not happy about it at all. They're accusing the U.S. of meddling in their affairs, and they're hoping that the new Trump administration will be more friendly towards Orbán.
This is going to be a tough one for the new administration. They want to be tough on corruption and stand up for democracy, but they also want to keep NATO strong, and they know that Orbán's a valuable ally, especially when it comes to dealing with Russia. It's a tricky situation.
It could really test the unity of NATO, which is not good, especially with all the other problems going on in the world. Okay, let's end on a story that's a little bit like a spy thriller. A Cambodian opposition leader was assassinated in broad daylight in Bangkok.
Yeah, the guy's name was Lim Kimya, and he was a former member of parliament from the CNRP, a party that was banned by the Cambodian government. They caught the whole thing on camera. The assassin walked right up to Lim Kimya and shot him in cold blood.
Everyone's pointing the finger at the Cambodian government, which has a reputation for being really brutal and silencing its opponents. This kind of thing, attacking people in other countries, is called transnational repression, and it's becoming more and more common.
The assassin was identified pretty quickly. He used to be in the Thai Navy, but now he drives a motorbike taxi. But there are already questions about whether the Thai police will actually do a thorough investigation. Thailand has a history of sending political refugees back to their home countries, where they often face persecution.
And now Thailand's on the UN Human Rights Council, so everyone's watching to see how they handle this case. It's a real test of their commitment to justice and human rights.
It's scary to think that people can be targeted like that, even when they're in another country. It makes you realize that nowhere is truly safe when you're dealing with a government that's willing to go to those lengths.
It's a sobering thought. And speaking of sobering, our last story is about the situation in Venezuela. We have an interview with a former political prisoner. We're calling him Juan to protect his identity. He was arrested after those protests following the disputed presidential election.
Yeah, the one where Maduro was declared the winner, even though the opposition said there was a lot of fraud. Those protests were huge, and the government cracked down hard on anyone who spoke out against them.
Juan told us about the horrible conditions in Tocaron prison: overcrowding, barely any food, torture, both physical and psychological. He said there were even special punishment cells where they do even worse things to the prisoners.
It's heartbreaking. Juan said it felt like being in a concentration camp. And his story is not unique. There are tons of reports from human rights groups and the UN about the widespread abuse going on in Venezuelan prisons.
The government denies everything, of course, but it's clear that there's a real problem there. Juan's story is a reminder of what people go through when they stand up for what they believe in, especially when they're up against a powerful and ruthless government.
It's inspiring, though, to see that even after everything he's been through, Juan is still determined to fight for change in Venezuela. He wants to see a future where everyone has basic human rights and freedoms.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope. Well, that's all the time we have for today. We covered a lot of ground, from wildfires in LA to political intrigue in Europe to human rights abuses in South America. It's a lot to take in, but it's important to stay informed and to remember that even though the world can be a pretty scary place sometimes, there are still good people fighting for a better future.
Absolutely. And it's up to all of us to support those people and to do what we can to make a difference.
Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll see you next time.